So let's jump in for questions. Are there any thoughts about?
I have one. So I saw one sort of brief mention about costing, and one of my worries as a data engineer is that some of these things kind of hide how expensive a certain deployment or use of cloud, which I know we've all been burnt in the past by either over provisioning or those sorts of things, or forgetting to turn things off even. So how do I balance that, the flexibility and the simplicity of having all of these tools to manage cloud and multi-cloud and hyper-cloud situations with not me as the person architecting something, not burning myself with cost? You know, that's a constant trade-off, right?
Yeah, good question. And because it's funny, I can't tell you how many times I've heard from IT ops and cloud ops people that my app dev and my DevOps people will over provision a giant machine because they want to get the work done. And I end up with all these giant machines. And so that's one of the reasons we're really trying to come at it from two primary directions, because we can't control the cost of a hyperscaler's cloud resource. They charge what they charge for a VM or a gigabyte per month of storage. So the two areas we're trying to come at it. Number one, we're trying to come at it from optimization of the resource, from a storage equation, compression, compaction, dedupe, and tiering. You've seen us bring all of those. Those are technologies that evolved in the data center over decades. You now have that in the cloud. You can have infrequently used data tiered off to super cheap cold archive, for example, under a single namespace, so that when the application asks for it, it gets it, just takes a little longer. That's an example we're doing at the infrastructure layer. Also, on the compute side, with the reason we've invested so greatly in Spot and Cloud Checker, et cetera, so the customer knows what they're having and they can have resources delivered on demand at a fraction of the list price if they can use Spot or reserved instances, as an example. But the second way we're coming at it, and it has to do with the automation and the integration and the policy-based deployment. One of the things I showed in the demo, I'm a DevOps guy. I've got that profile. I sign on and I want to create a 50 gig NFS volume for me to use for my DevOps. I'm going to have a template presented to me that's going to use this VM instead of this VM. It may take me longer because my company has decided that's what I'm going to do. It may have restrictions on what services I can turn on for it, because those are all charged and based, et cetera. And then we'll tie back into some of the other reporting to end up, is it stale? Has it been out there for a long time? Has it not been used? Do you want to release this? Those are kind of the areas we're trying to come at it, because it's a problem. It's a very real problem that exists in the world. And we think you've got to come at it from a number of different angles. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I was hoping to hear the policy-based thing as being a contributor to that, because, you know, like, I'm going to say it's my developers, but sometimes it's me. It's like, yeah, throw 50 nodes at this data warehouse that I'm playing with in a prototype. And that's expensive.
Karen, you're absolutely right, because what we found is that 30% of cloud spend is overspend. So that, you know, another reason why these are the things that we look at, and Chuck and his team are trying to figure out, you know, how do we help reduce that with the tools?
So I was first of all wondering if the performance tiers available, are there performance tiers? I think that's what you discussed as well, that 4.4, that's FSX on ONTAP. Yeah. So are they identical to the cloud volume service that you normally provide? Are they the same performance tiers, or is there a difference between them?
So they are similar, they are not exactly identical. So what you see with FSX versus what you see with ANF on Azure versus what you see with CVS in Google. So we have the standard performance, and then as we need more IOPS per gigabyte, then you go to higher and higher tiers. So one of the things we can do is that without having to reformat or redo anything, you can instantly change between these tiers as your application needs go up and down. And that flexibility is important also, that while I'm running SAP HANA and doing something throughout the day, then I need the extreme level of performance. Then at night, if I'm running backups, doing some cloning, then I can lower those tiers. So you can actually do those up and down, but we do offer those. And of course, it depends on which hyperscaler it is, because the nomenclature is slightly different on these tiers. And the pricing is slightly different also.
Exactly, that's exactly why I'm asking that question, because you typically put workloads on it, and sometimes there are multiple workloads on the same data store, right? So how do you manage that? Is that something that automatically scales and lets you know about the pricing, or do you have to change it manually? How does that process work? And can you deliver performance of any, say, HANA, for example, on FSX?
So there's kind of two questions. I think there's one other thing I wanted to say, which is that usually when you are doing these migrations from virtualization into, a cloud, even if you're just going from a VM into an EC2 instance, there's that process of right sizing afterwards, because you only know how well it operates in that one environment. And so part of the flexibility is making an educated guess, some sort of estimate, running some POCs, and then going, okay, let's tune it once we get there. So that's the other way you'd use that. And in terms of the level of performance, I mean, we do see, I don't know if we've got all the certifications, but we definitely have workloads that are in the highest performance tiers running on these platforms, and being able to deliver that level of performance that those applications are asking for. And that's kind of what you're thinking about, is migrating the enterprise level applications, the large, heavy, performant applications from on-premises to run in cloud native. And now, yes, absolutely you can. And we are seeing a lot of our customers doing that across different clouds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because what I also heard in the question is, if I'm using FSX and VMC or ANF and AVS, are they the pricing tiers that I know and I'm used to, and I can check on a website, is it the same pricing, or are you creating special pricing? That's what I heard.
Yeah.
We're not creating special pricing. So what we're doing is making sure that FSX can be a shared external data store with VMC, for example, or if you look in the Azure world, ANF and AVS, and they are the standard tiers that you can look at and know, and you might have been using for other workloads, and you've been waiting for the ability to use that as an external shared data store. And we're not creating artificial layers. We're trying to reduce the complexity, not increase the complexity. When you get, AJ talked about the auto scaling or auto performance scaling, we think that reduces the complexity, but it's still between the standard tiers.
Yeah. Also, there are pretty elaborate TCO and sizing calculators that VMware and NetApp have worked together along with hyperscalers to make sure that depending on what your environments are, what your use cases are, workflows are, how to size it right, and what the cost estimates would be. So those things are all available, as well as being worked on and improved.
Yeah, thank you. And your question, I mean, obviously I was talking from both cost and performance point of views, both. So one last question, quick one, because I wasn't quite clear in the end about what was the answer to the inter-availability zone traffic. Are we dropping that price already, or have we dropped that cost already, or we are thinking about it? I wasn't clear on that.
The egress?
Yeah, so inter-availability zone costs for the data
that has
transfer.
been removed for quite a while, actually. We don't carry that anymore.
But that's what's for vSAN specifically. I'm talking
No.
about
That
this.
is for any VMware cloud on AWS setup, regardless of whether you have the local storage or the external storage. We just do not expose the egress charges any longer to the customer. There are egress charges, by the way. We incur the cost of it.
No. Exactly. It's also my concern, obviously, was about the data storage side of things, because this is a new service, or as far as I know, it is.
It is a new service, yes.
So does that apply? And it does.
But you won't be able to see that in your monthly billing, or even if you purchase it as an RI, you're not going to see it.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's the other thing, that you can buy reserved instances, you can do on demand, you can sign a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year subscriptions. So the pricing changes accordingly. And then we internally, even for our engineering teams and dev teams, I mean, we have to manage costs, right, for all of these.
I actually wanted to add a point to your question. See, I don't know if you caught those steps in the demo that AJ was showing. You do have an ability to choose the throughput that you can then decide which one is more apt for your workloads. Now, throughput becomes a big deal, of course, as you know, because you're going to have to connect the the VPCs across, right? Meaning, if you're familiar with how VMC on AWS works, you connect the shadow VPC to the AWS VPC. So you want the best throughput there as well. So it is not so much as just the tiers within the data stores, but you want to pair it with the most appropriate throughput band that will make sense for the workloads. And those steps actually lets you do that. You can play around with it and see what the total cost is, how much of SSDs you would need. For example, sometimes you may need all 100% flash, right? So you play around with that tool a bit, and you will find out that the extreme most costly would be an 100% flash with 2048 megabits throughput.
Right.
And that's your high end. And then your low end would be, 256 meg of throughput and, almost less than 20% of flash. So you can play around with those tiers. Now, I also detected a different kind of question in your overall picture. Are you also looking at scenarios where you start with a certain tier, and then as your usage grows, you're expecting us to automatically move you to the next tier?
It was partly that if you are doing it, not necessarily, if it's automatic, as long as the customer knows about what the cost implication would be, and then approves it or something, and it automatically moves to that tier, that could be a use case. Although I understand that because they are based on data store levels, then you change the performance tier for the data store, right? So
yeah, but if you are consuming it as an on-demand, you can change it. But if you purchase reserved subscription,
then
you're fixed in that reserved subscription.
of course, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for the explanation.
Yeah, and then the storage efficiencies that Chuck showed in the cloud manager, they all apply for FSx and dedupe compression and how much data is there. You can even tear it down further to S3, all those things.
So just for my edification, is this fully available with Azure VMware solution as well, or are we talking about just VMware Cloud?
So this is, we have a public preview with Azure VMware solution, but that's with Azure NetApp files. So obviously the architecture that we showed you today was for VMware Cloud, and we obviously understand that the Azure VMware solution is a different architecture. We didn't show that, but in terms of how we're integrating, it's the same way.
Just a minor nitpick. When you say VMware Cloud, Azure is also VMware Cloud. So what we showed today was a managed service running on AWS only. However, NetApp being the real Switzerland here, they have the same FSxN services running on Azure VMware service. That is what we refer to as AVS in short form, but it's the same three pillars, except instead of AWS, it's Azure.
With Azure NetApp files.
Yeah.
So the managed file service in Azure from NetApp is Azure NetApp files. Nomenclature is one of those things that differentiates us between clouds too.
I want to go back to the report that you were showing, and I just wanted to ask, when is that report going to be publicly available so we can look through it?
Probably the end of this week.
Okay.
If not early next week. Yeah, we're just putting the final finishing touches on the formatting and the creative.
Was there anything else about the report that you found particularly interesting? Because I think you ran out of time a little bit and probably had a little more to say about it. So
I did. And actually, one of the things, I wanted to tell you guys about the use cases that we saw. Because, when it comes to moving data, why are customers moving data? And it was interesting to see the results of this report because, I had different discussions with different customers about how they're using hybrid cloud, and DR and backup had always been a primary use case because I think that that's just the most readily understood. But this study that we did showed that actually analytics came out as number one. And then I started looking at, well, actually, you know, that makes sense. Because if you look at a couple of the examples that I provided, like with the F1 team from Aston Martin, and then also Dow Jones, I mean, those are all about analytics. So like the more that I started looking at other, you know, case studies and customer stories that we had, I'm like, yeah, actually, you know, analytics, I can see that. So, which is interesting because, you know, even you talk to the analysts and they'll tell you, oh yeah, well, you know, DR and backup is the primary use case for hybrid cloud. And the others, you know, are really far behind, but this showed that that wasn't so. So that was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I've run into that actually pretty often where they're either shipping data between clouds or from on-prem to the cloud, because that's where the big analytics engines are. And if you don't want to pay to have a whole data center full of servers that are just crunching numbers, send up to the cloud. That's kind of what it's there for. And then you don't have to pay the egress charge to bring it back down because you did all your analysis up there.
Exactly. And we have some large financial customers that do exactly that. And, you know, and that actually matched up with what we saw in terms of frequency, because if you see, you know, like monthly, quarterly, because they're doing reporting, you know, on certain intervals. So it's not necessarily a daily thing or, you know, a weekly thing, but just, you know, in intervals. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's kind of cool to look at.
I wanted to go back as well, just on that point, to something Karen was talking about, cloud data sense earlier, and I just wanted to point out one of the reasons I think we move towards the more of the data insight, like what is your data, where is your data, who's accessing your data, is for that reason, because one of the key workflows that data sense now enables is you can see what all your data is beyond just it's a volume containing some files, but what are those files, whose are those files, and choose what you want to move. And it automates some of that process of, okay, I want to move these kinds of files into a different volume or into the cloud. And so that means that you're not transferring data that you don't have to. And I think that's part of that, you know, you think about how much data there is, and it's easy to just go, yeah, move everything, but that takes a long time. So yeah, when that becomes this monthly, weekly kind of schedule, you want to be a little bit more specific about what data is being moved.
Yeah, and then cloud data sense is even more powerful, that not only it can look at data that's in ONTAP anywhere, but also data that's in many other places. So data that's in S3 or some of the SaaS applications, and not just the data in ONTAP. So user activity and data classification across those things, it can track those.
And identify what is in those files.
Right.
Is it sensitive data that shouldn't be backed up or protected or moved, that needs to stay within certain geographies based upon regulatory requirements?
Yeah, because actually with some of these, I mean, not the demo I was showing, but there is a corollary of that where cloud data sense actually scans the VMs or the data that's moving to cloud and make sure it's okay to move that data store to cloud, and there is no personally identifiable or whatever flags the customer may have set up policies with. So it can actually act as a filter and screen that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think to your point earlier, we were talking, you know, thinking about what makes it more simple or more flexible or more secure. I think it's some of those workflows that we're trying to enable, rather than trying to just make the technology simple, right? I mean, we can abstract out all the complexity that we want, but it's the workflows that people are actually trying to do with that we're trying to simplify or build policies around. I don't know, does that resonate with you guys? Is that something that you want to see more of, or?
Very much so, because to your point, taking out steps of, you know, the simple processes of, you know, provisioning storage or moving things around or whatever it is, can only go so far. And for the most part, I feel like a lot of that has been pretty well simplified. So I love that you called that out, that what are the next steps? What can we do with this data now that we have it? How can we manage it better? How do we get it to go different places with minimal efforts? Is definitely a part of that simplification piece that we need in the multi-cloud. So for me, I would say yes, absolutely.
I totally agree. So sometimes in technology, right, because we can, but we forget why are we doing this? It's not because we have, well, I mean, it's fun, but engineering, well, we're doing it to serve the business lines, usually to accomplish business. And the workflows plays a much bigger role where you, to your point, right, I have policies, protected data. There's something that still, in my opinion, can be simplified and more across the whole organization, right? So you have a bunch of island solutions sometimes. This has this policy, this has this policy. And I dream of being easier, having it more adapt to the workflow, right? Okay, so accounting does this versus accounting trying to work around a solution that, in this case, NetApp or someone else would provide, is a more centralized policy model behind it. And the technology adapts to the workflow versus the workflow adapts to technology. I think we still have some room for improvement there for sure.